Opioid addiction is a national public health crisis that affects individuals and families regardless of their age, race, or income. The statistics are overwhelming. More than 130 people die from opioid addiction every day. But there is hope. Recovery is possible. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not replace advice from a medical provider when making healthcare decisions. This podcast contains opinionated content and may not reflect the opinions of any organizations this podcast is affiliated with. We will discuss opioid use, opioid treatment, and physical and psychological trauma, which may be triggering for some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. In Season 2, we're focusing on the next generation of young people facing the opioid crisis. And today, on Someone You Know, we're joined by author, motivational speaker, and wellness advocate Chris Herren. Chris is a former professional basketball player and a figurehead in the recovery community, and you may know his story from his ESPN 30 for 30 film, Unguarded and The First Day. On this episode, we discuss Chris's journey and how he is using his lived experience to educate and influence students, athletes, and communities across the country. Through his work with Herren Talks and Herren Wellness, Chris has spoken to over 1 million students nationwide on substance abuse, self-esteem, and wellness. I'm your host, Heather Major, and this is Someone You Know. So Chris, let's talk a little bit about your background. You have a journey, a very well-documented journey with substance misuse and recovery. I think that you've been very generous with the media over the years in sharing your story and sharing parts of your story that I think are very personal. And I want to thank you first and foremost for being that open. And of course, for the work that you have done and continue to do around these conversations and breaking down that stigma of addiction. So we have listeners in many different states and actually many different countries. And so I think it would be helpful to start with you providing a bit of background on yourself, specific to your journey with addiction, and maybe more importantly, your journey in recovery.
So my name's Chris Herren. I'm a person in long-term recovery, although I feel like a newcomer at 12 and a half years. My journey began, I grew up in a home that suffered because of alcoholism. And to be quite frank, it still suffers. My dad, unfortunately, is still suffering from this illness. And, it's tragic, it's sad. I'm still his son. It's the work I do today is helping so many, but yet someone so close, I feel so far away from. But I think when it comes to addiction, right? And I think this is important when it comes to the stigma. I think we put so much focus on the worst day and we forget the first day. We talk to our children what drugs do to you in the end, rather than sitting them down and ask them why they're beginning. But my beginning, my father's alcoholism tremendously impacted not only me, but my family and my home. I grew up on eggshells, the unknown, not knowing what he was going to look like when he came in and how everyone was going to respond to it. I grew up drinking and started smoking marijuana at a young age. And slowly but surely transitioned into harder drugs. I was a McDonald's All-American in high school. I was playing in front of 4,000 people every night at a home game. Things looked really well for me. But there was this internal struggle, kind of waiting always for the shoe to drop. After high school, I transitioned into college and I was introduced to cocaine. And cocaine, for people who have used cocaine, it was like my truth serum. I stayed up late and I drank a lot of alcohol and I smoked a lot of cigarettes and I did a lot of cocaine. And I talked about my feelings and I talked about my emotions and things I missed in my childhood. And I unfortunately, had a love-hate relationship with it for a long time. After college, I was drafted into the NBA and I was introduced to painkillers. I was introduced to OxyContin. In 1999, OxyContin was not in the headlines. necessarily. In 1999, I remember reading an article about it, and they called it hillbilly heroin. And it was ravaging West Virginia and Kentucky. Unfortunately, I was already deep into it. I was taking 1,600 milligrams a day while playing in the NBA, and slowly but surely transitioned to heroin. And I struggled with heroin for 7.5 years, suffered multiple overdoses. My first overdose was in 2004. I remember waking up the next morning and the Boston Globe, a world-renowned newspaper, the headline was "What a Shame." So I think we've come a long way. I don't think that headline would fly today in a newspaper like the Boston Globe. But, suffering that first overdose in 2004, I realized, that I was chasing death for that feeling. And, every morning I woke up and left my home and said goodbye to my children, and I was going to take a chance at dying that day. And not only once, but multiple times a day. So, by the grace of God and a lot of work and a lot of support, I found recovery at 32 years old. And, here I am today, coming up on 13 years sober. And just unbelievably blessed to have a seat at the table, to be part of something bigger than me and part of something so special, to witness, multiple miracles on a daily basis, is something that I have great admiration for and gratitude.
Thanks for sharing that, Chris. When you look back, were there points in time where you knew that your addiction was sort of taking over, and or did you feel that it was manageable? At what point did you have reflections on what this meant, knowing that you had an alcoholic father and that you had you were using drugs? Where were you in some of those moments?
I think as an athlete and a full scholarship athlete, I was made aware pretty quickly when I stepped on the campus of Boston College that I was held to a higher level. There was a higher standard for me, that I had to stay drug-free, and that I was subjected to random drug testing. And, that first year at Boston College, when I struggled mightily passing drug tests. And, immediately that gave me some insight that, if you can't pass drug tests to play basketball in college, there has to be a problem. So it was kind of glaring to me at that point, when I was 18. And, not to mention, as a basketball player who grew up, in the Boston area, we lost, Len Bias due to cocaine. And, here I was, this 18-year-old kid. I just did a photo shoot for Sports Illustrated. The whole city of Boston is excited. And, I'm locked in a dorm room, for 36 hours, shoving cocaine up my nose. I was aware that it was a deadly drug. And, that was something that was very obvious to me at 18. And, from that point on, my addiction just spiraled and increased, and became much, much harder to manage.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel the expectations of being an athlete, outside of obviously, needing to pass a drug test or drug tests? How does that pressure? Athletes, and a lot of people in other fields, but athletes in particular, very achievement driven, often, afraid of failing, right? You're a basketball player, so you are on a team that obviously you expect your performance, your coach expects your performance, your team, relies on your performance. Talk to us a little bit about how those expectations sort of, either helped or hurt where you were in your active addiction.
I think, for me personally, I think it hurt, right? I had very little coping skills. My early teen years, adolescent years, I felt that divorce was imminent, and that my father's drinking was having way too much of a negative effect on our family. I didn't have a place to go. I never had a place to land. I didn't have the proper tools to discuss some of the things that I was struggling with. At the age of 14 years old, I started having to perform in front of grown men who critique me day in and day out. I would walk through this little tunnel at practice, and I would see college coaches sitting in the bleachers, with notepads and pens. And I was on stage, and I was on stage for a long time, and I didn't process that well. I didn't handle it well. I felt an immense amount of pressure, and oftentimes it came out in competition. I kind of took out my anger and my frustration in the game itself. And it worked for me for a period of time, right? But some of those coping skills doesn't transition into your adult years. And I unfortunately fell victim to a lot of those pressures that happened, in my teenage years.
What do you think would have been, as you're going into these very competitive, as you said, very competitive athletic programs, you're getting, full scholarship. There's so much pressure there. What do you think, though, were points where you could have identified resources or tools, or do you think, too young, needed more guidance, needed less microscope and more guidance on how to be, a successful student, a successful athlete, a contributing member of society? What are your thoughts there?
I just wish, in hindsight, I look back and I wish I was challenged in other areas of my life. I say this all the time. I speak, prior to COVID, I would do 250 speaking events a year. And, it amazes me that wellness isn't a core class in our school system. It amazes me that is not one of the core classes for our children to learn, social and emotional development and mindfulness and, all of these techniques that we keep away from our kids and we don't introduce them to them until they really necessarily need it. And sometimes, unfortunately, it's too late. My goal was, my pressure really didn't come in. It kind of manifested internally, but it was more of a external. Like, I cared about what other people thought of me. Mm-hmm. My insecurities were always glaring, and I was always worried about what other people thought of me. And that's something I struggled with. And it's something, to be quite frank, I struggle with today, right? It's one of my, character defects that, I have to work on a daily basis. So, my mom, she died when she was 51. I was active in heroin. But some of the final days of my mom's life, she expressed to me that she felt some sorrow and some guilt for not protecting me during those years. I was kind of on my own island, and, it's tough to be on your own island at 15 years old. So, it's something that I do today passionately, and I really push for it to educate our children and introduce them to coping skills and life skills. And I didn't have the proper tools at that age.
I think there's a lot to be said, and thank you for sharing all of that. So, Chris, your journey and the traumas in your journey, I think, were a lot of people can relate to it at certain points in their life, and I think that there's a lot to be said for building resiliency. There's a lot to be said for a lot of the great work that you do in mentorship, prevention, education, advocacy. Um, I'm wondering, why, whether there were certain points too where you were able to celebrate um, successful athlete, and all the things that came with putting all that work in. Were you able to appreciate or celebrate, or was the addiction and the trauma, um, did it just shadow everything?
No, I'm the addiction and my childhood 100% shadowed everything. Um, I could never escape it. It was always so close. It was always right there, and I knew it. No matter how successful I became, I knew at some point I was gonna lose it. And that was, it was such a struggle to be introduced as a Boston Celtic, right? And it's a big press conference, and I have media from all over New England, and I'm on stage holding my jersey, and all I can think about is OxyContin. All I could think about is how am I going to manage this addiction while I'm home playing for the Boston Celtics. It was tragic and sad, and nobody knew. It was something that I was battling with internally, and nobody was aware of how sad I was, and how complex that my addiction became, and my mind was focused 24 hours a day on my sickness, and very little time spent only physically, a couple hours a day focused on my profession.
Well, a lot of the work you're doing today, and I don't want to speak for you because we definitely want to hear about this, but it
Mhm.
seems to be a lot of the work you're doing today and have been doing has really, I think, harnessed not only your experience, your knowledge, your personal feelings, but also it sounds like the inherent qualities and characteristics that your parents, the positive, right, that your
Mm.
parents um, instilled in you. And so maybe you could give us a little bit more about the many, many, many students and athletes who get to hear your story, who have conversations with you on substance use disorder through Herren
Mhm.
Talks.
Mhm. It started by accident. I had lost my license in early recovery. I had multiple OUIs, operating under the influence, and I was unemployed. And a teacher at a local high school, probably 15 minutes, said, I read your story in the newspaper, and I think you could have impact on my students. Would you be open to coming to sharing your story? And she's like, I don't have a budget. I can just buy you a coffee. Um, I know you don't have a license, so I'll pick you up. And she did. And she picked me up 8 days in a row to talk to 8 different classes. And from those 8 classes, a neighboring school heard that I spoke, and they brought me in. And, that was 10 and a half years ago. And I think I've been in front of almost 2 million kids today. I've spoke in every state in the United States. It's something that I'm unbelievably passionate about. And, but I've evolved not only as a speaker, but as a person in recovery. And, when I went into schools, I would tell my personal story. And I felt only telling that piece was playing into the stigma. It was the worst day, and it wasn't the first day. It was talking about the end rather than why it began. So to walk into schools today and ask them why, to look at parents and challenge them to not focus on where they got it, who they were with, or how much they did, to sit their daughter down, look her in the eye, and ask her why. I think it's very relevant, and I think it's very personal, and I think kids really have been able to identify with the messaging. So, my work is probably my greatest accomplishment. I played in the NBA, and I played 82 games. I'm on 250 high school basketball courts a year, and college arenas and auditoriums. And so it's, I go after it like I'm competing because I know what's at stake, and I love it.
You have said a couple of times, the last day to the first day.
Mm,
Can we expand on that? Can we talk a little bit more about that, and maybe a little bit more about your film
mm.
and what you're looking to do with the first day?
It's I think it's really hard for children to identify with myself, right? I walk into their school and I tell the story of transitioning as far down as to heroin and crystal meth and wearing a Celtics jersey and being outside the arena. And I think that's really hard to identify with. But I think kids can identify with being 14, lying to your parents, breaking promises that you made to your family, and walking down into a basement where children are partying, and you feel so awkward that you break your promise, and you do something that you walked out of your home an hour earlier and promised your parents you wouldn't. So I think kids can really identify with the insecurities and the self-esteem and the self-worth and the peer pressure. So that's, to me, that's the beginning. And like I say to kids all the time, the scariest thing about addiction and the scariest thing about alcoholism to me is nobody knows who has it. Nobody knows who's going to suffer from it. And you can walk down into that basement on a Friday night, like I did. And I know one thing, the basement that I drank in at 15, 16, and 17 years old, as adults, half of that basement chose heroin. And half of my friend group became opiate dependent. And nobody had those intentions. So if we can challenge our kids to be better socially and emotionally, and build on their self-esteem and self-worth and increase their awareness, and the impact that some of the decisions that they make in their teenage years will be will translate into their adult years and transition into their adult years. So that's where I'm at, and that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to create voices in the bleachers. And if a young girl can walk out of there and roll up her sleeves and show her teacher that she's been self-harming, for the last year, or if there's a young boy who walks out and says, my dad's like his dad, and when he was 14, I kind of feel the same way as he did. That's to me the first day, and that's the power of it. So we, the goal is to get it in front of as many kids as possible. It's interesting because during COVID, I was really careful. I did not want kids watching the first day by themselves. I wanted them to be in the company of adults and teachers and counselors. And I thought it would be irresponsible to have, a young child sit down and watch that without anybody to kind of unload on or unload with. But it's one of my greatest accomplishments. It really is. Unguarded, my first documentary that was on ESPN, that was for the people suffering and their families. And the first day is for the kids and for the students and for the parents. I was given a gift. I was 32. My family was put back together on a daily basis. My beautiful wife. I broke it and she put it back together as best as she could. But I was given a gift to go to treatment, and I had no health insurance and no money. But I went, and I'm very fortunate that all those nights I laid in bed and said, I need to go home and fix it. I chose to hesitate and do another day. And because of the gift that I was given, I wanted to give back. And the Herren Project has helped over 5,000 people in the last 10 years get into treatment. But it's also evolved, right? It's evolved into peer support, clinicians, prevention, family education, and online meetings. And, Herren Project, we have 26 family support groups a week. I think the family, when it comes to substance use, is so underserved, and they don't get what they deserve when it comes to the treatment process. I think so many centers over the years have gotten away with, you can't come here because you can't see anyone, so drop them off at the front door and I'll see you in 28 days. And that loved one's picking that person up in 28 days, and they got to jump in the car together. And you don't know the health of that relationship. So for me, with Herren Project and also Herren Wellness, I think the family is an integral part of recovery, and they need to be on a parallel path of recovery, their own path, but one that they embrace, and they continue on, just to be able to support their loved ones. I'm sitting at my wellness center, and I'm in a hyperbaric chamber room, and for me, as someone in recovery, I wanted to just offer as much as possible, right? So I'm not going to advertise. I'm not going to say that I do this and not do it. But the acupuncture and the massage therapy and the hyperbaric chamber and the personal trainer and the nutritionist and the dietitian, like all this stuff, it matters. It matters in recovery, especially early recovery. We track sleep. Why do we not track sleep in such a critical moment of one's life, where they might respond better to meeting with their life coach at 2:00 in the afternoon because they only slept 4 hours last night?
Right.
So, we're innovative here. We have a lot of different, we think out of the box and techniques that are applicable, honestly, that I learned in athletics. A lot of the stuff that made me a high performer in athletics is now part of my recovery program. My center is, average length of stay is 90 days. And, we have people that will just leave the property and go for a run, go for 6-7 miles. But I know how important that is to people, and how gratifying and rewarding it can be. And people say to me all the time, other wellness center owners, and they say, you're crazy to let people go for a run. And, I'll take the risk, because, the reward of recovery at the back end of this, because of, the structure and the discipline that they're implementing here to sustain in long-term recovery is tremendous. And, my foundation, I think we have 3,000 runners. We do Hong Kong, Berlin. We have marathons all over the world that people run for my foundation.
We're so grateful to you for wanting to have this conversation today, and for your voice and for what you're doing. And I think maybe even before all of that, we're so grateful that you're here.
Yeah.
That you're here and that you're healthy, and that you are so passionate about making this journey available, accessible, and possible for others.
I want to thank the whole crew for setting this up, and thank you so much.
Thanks,
Awesome.
Chris. You're the best.
Yeah.
This is really phenomenal. If you or someone you know is suffering from opioid addiction, please visit ibxfoundation.org/SYK. The link is in our show notes below.